go ahead and move on to our next presenter.
My name is Alyssa Aguirre, and I'm the Assistant Director of Dementia Care Transformation at Bell Medical School. I am happy to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Maya Henry. Dr. Henry is an Associate Professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin and is Director of the Aphasia Research and Treatment Lab. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Texas at Austin and her MS and PhD from the University of Arizona in Tucson. Dr. Henry completed an NIH postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California's Memory and Aging Center, a leading research center investigating atypical dementias such as frontotemporal dementia and early-onset Alzheimer's disease. In 2014, she joined the faculty in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. Her clinical and research interests are in the nature and treatment of aphasia caused by stroke and neurodegenerative disease. Funded by the National Institutes of Health, her research has explored cognitive and neural bases of spoken and written language, as well as the rehabilitation of language impairments associated with primary progressive aphasia. Dr. Henry has published her research in a variety of journals, published several book chapters, and presented her research in national and international conferences. Please help me welcome Dr. Maya Henry.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you so much to the organizers of today's event. All right, hopefully everybody can see this okay. Today I'll be talking to you about speech and language interventions to maximize communication in primary progressive aphasia. And I'll start just by saying that despite the fact that PPA is being recognized with greater frequency and diagnosed with better accuracy than ever before, the vast majority of patients with this diagnosis are still not referred for speech and language interventions. Okay, so let's talk just for a second about language and normal aging. When I speak with particularly lay audiences about communication changes in primary progressive aphasia, people often come up to me after the talk and say, oh my goodness, I think I have that. I have trouble coming up with words. I'm getting older. I'm really worried. And the truth is that issues with word finding are one of the most common complaints that occur cognitively with healthy aging. And the research shows us that word finding does decline with age. We've learned that this is difficulty with accessing words as you need them, though, and not really a deterioration of the vocabulary store or of your conceptual knowledge about things in the world. So that's the good news. Older adults actually outperform younger adults on vocabulary tests, and conceptual knowledge or semantic information is well preserved into old age. So when do speech-language pathologists like myself become concerned that changes in communication are not normal? Well, when the decline is more rapid than we would expect for a person's age, or when we see changes that are occurring in younger individuals, and particularly when cognitive or motoric processes that aren't typically affected by aging are noticeably impaired. So, for example, when people are having trouble with intelligibly articulating words, when they're having trouble speaking in correct and complete sentences. And when someone is noticing these kinds of changes, and they may end up in a neurologist's office and ultimately come to see a speech and language clinician, this is the kind of thing that we hear. This is a quote from one of our patients who noticed that she was walking down the street one day and she looked down at the sidewalk and she realized she just couldn't come up with the name of that thing. And she was noticing this kind of thing more and more often, realizing that something really was wrong. So when this does turn out to be a difficulty that's sort of outside the bounds of what we think of as language changes associated with healthy aging, we must consider a diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia. And this is a slowly evolving aphasia caused by underlying neurodegenerative disease. So unlike most of the patients who a practicing speech pathologist will see who have aphasia caused by a stroke, this is aphasia in the context of a neurodegenerative disease. And importantly, the communication problem is the prominent feature. So this is in the absence of other issues with cognition, memory, motoric changes, at least early in the disease. There are now 3 widely recognized clinical variants of progressive aphasia: a non-fluent agrammatic variant, a semantic variant, and a logopenic variant. The non-fluent patients have trouble speaking in sentences. They have trouble with articulating words because they have motor speech impairment. The semantic patients have trouble with word meanings and have difficulty with naming, but also with comprehension of words. And logopenic patients also have trouble with naming, but probably for a different reason. They have trouble assembling sounds for output. The former 2, non-fluent and semantic variants, are considered to be subtypes of frontotemporal dementia, whereas the logopenic variant is considered an atypical language-prominent variant of Alzheimer's disease. And we've now learned that these different clinical phenotypes are associated not only with distinct patterns of behavior, but with unique topography of underlying brain atrophy, and also, importantly, with underlying pathological entities. So non-fluent patients and semantic patients, again, being associated with frontotemporal dementia pathologies, tauopathies, and TDP proteinopathies, and logopenic patients, the most common finding is Alzheimer's pathology at autopsy. So I mention this because speech language pathologists now play an important role in helping to identify early and often subtle changes in communication that can be, that are now considered to be important biomarkers in terms of predicting underlying pathology. And this is relevant as we think about, hopefully, forthcoming pharmacological interventions that can be directed at these different diseases. But in the absence of any kind of pharmacological intervention that can significantly alter the trajectory of these diseases at this time, clinicians are faced with the question of whether we can make a difference in communication and quality of life for patients with primary progressive aphasia. There's been a lot of progress in the last couple of decades understanding the neurobiology of progressive aphasia, its cognitive and linguistic factors, but a lot less research directed at behavioral treatment. And this is despite a really robust literature supporting speech and language intervention for patients with aphasia caused by stroke. So there's a real disconnect there in terms of both the research literature and clinical practice. I think that the lack of research in speech language intervention for PPA relates to clinical pessimism on the part of both referring and treating clinicians, as well as third-party reimbursers. And this is one of the things that we're really hoping to change. We conducted a recent systematic review of behavioral treatment in progressive aphasia and progressive apraxia of speech. That's what PPAOS stands for. This is when there's a relatively isolated motor speech impairment. And we were surprised to uncover nearly 90 studies. Most of them are single subject experimental designs with a handful of experimental group studies and randomized controlled trials. We found that each of the clinical phenotypes of progressive aphasia was well represented in this body of work, but that the majority of studies focused on naming interventions, so interventions for word retrieval, with less attention directed at other communication skills. But really, just to sort of home in on the big picture here, what we found when looking at treatment effects in these studies is that almost all studies showed a significant improvement in treated behaviors, with most studies showing generalization of skills to non-treated targets, tasks, or contexts. And really importantly, we found that most studies show maintenance beyond the immediate post-treatment period. So patients are improving as a result of treatment, and they're showing maintenance of gains, sometimes up to 18 months post-treatment. So what are we doing here at UT Austin? We're investigating through NIH-funded studies a couple of different restitutive treatments. And by restitutive, I mean treatments designed to rebuild lost communication skills in mild to moderate patients. So we've developed a couple of different interventions targeting naming for those patients with primary naming deficits, and targeting speech production and fluency for our non-fluent patients who have trouble with grammar and articulation. I'll talk just briefly about each. focusing really on our outcomes data. So our naming treatment is really designed to retrain specific vocabulary, but also to encourage patients to self-cue so that when they get stuck in conversation and can't come up with a word, they have a strategy that we hope will generalize. We work on individually tailored treatment targets, so our patients help us to identify words and pictures that they'd like to work on. And the dosage is pretty consistent with what's done in standard clinical practice. So these are our outcomes data. These are our data for both trained in green and untrained targets that patients are attempting to name. We've found a significant improvement for semantic and logopenic patients alike that's maintained up to 1 year post-treatment. And importantly, we found generalized improvement to untrained targets that is maintained up to 6 months post-treatment in these patients. When we look at pre-treatment brain imaging to try to understand what neural structures are at play in terms of mediating treatment response, we found that brain volumes in relatively anatomically spared language nodes in the left hemisphere are significant predictors of treatment response, as well as left hippocampal volumes, suggesting that there's also an episodic mechanism at play in terms of relearning vocabulary in these patients. Now, quickly, just to talk about our treatment for non-fluent patients, we use what's called script training. We create functional scripts about topics that patients want to communicate about. We create personalized home practice videos and ask patients to engage in 30 minutes of unison speech production practice every day, working on this targeted scripted content. So we tailor the scripts to the individual patient's interests, but also in terms of their difficulty. And the video uses sort of over-articulated articulatory gestures to provide a visual model for speech production in individuals who have motoric impairment. And what we see in terms of outcomes, significant improvement in percent correct and intelligible script production at post-treatment that's maintained up to 1 year post-treatment. And then in this larger cohort, we see that not only is that pattern holding up as we collect more data, but on the right-hand panel, you can see that there are a number of participants here in these red bars who are actually showing improvement on untrained content. So they're getting more grammatical and more intelligible, even for content that we haven't trained them on. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms at play there a little bit better. When we look at brain imaging at pre-treatment to try to predict which structures are critical for mediating treatment response, we found that this posterior temporal region that you see in green is a significant predictor. And this is a region that is thought to encode visual targets for speech motor control, perhaps compensating for damage to these more dorsal structures that are typically thought to be critical for speech production and fluency. So what do I think the potent ingredients are for beneficial treatment in PPA? So this is the message for clinicians. We think the strategic nature of our treatment is critical, and that's why we see generalized improvement. So we care not only about whether patients get better at a specific target set of words and naming those words in the clinic, but we want people to get better at communication more broadly. And so we are seeing generalized improvement because we're training patients on a strategy. We think training people on functionally relevant and salient content is important, and we're sure to focus in our research on individually tailored stimuli and tasks. And lastly, we make practice available to patients at home via digital modules so that we're able to boost the dosage of our treatment. In addition to working with the clinician, we provide patients with the ability to practice on their own time. Just want to quickly highlight our bilingual PPA treatment project, which is spearheaded by Stephanie Grasso, who's new faculty in the Department of Speech Language Hearing Sciences at UT. She has implemented treatment with bilingual persons who speak a number of different language pairs with really robust findings and is targeting generalization from one language to another. to try to get more bang for our buck in terms of intervention, and has a new collaboration with researchers in Spain, working specifically with bilinguals who speak Spanish and Catalan, again, showing really robust results. So we're excited about that work. Some new projects underway. We're adapting and extending our treatment protocols to accommodate for different patient profiles. So a significant proportion of individuals with dementia have hearing loss. So we're making sure to develop interventions that are accessible to people with significant hearing loss. We're looking at counseling intervention in combination with speech and language interventions, because the psychosocial ramifications of these disorders cannot be understated. We're developing multimodal communication training modules and approaches, because speech production is not going to be available to people with PPA throughout the course of their disease. They need to think about augmenting speech with other modes. And we're working on communication partner training, recognizing that communication doesn't just happen in a vacuum, but conversation partners play a really important role in successful communication. And then lastly, we're moving from just looking at pre-treatment brain imaging to study imaging predictors of response to treatment, but we're looking at how the brain changes in response to language intervention through fMRI and EEG studies. Okay, to sum up, hopefully I've convinced you that speech and language interventions in PPA are efficacious and warranted. Our studies and the studies that I highlighted in the systematic review indicate that treatment is beneficial. And the imaging work that we've done and are continuing to do shows that behavioral restitution is possible in the context of neurodegeneration. And then lastly, we think our treatment research has broad ramifications for service provision in patients with brain disease more broadly, who've been historically underserved by rehabilitation specialists. So we think this work is relevant beyond just PPA to dementia and neurodegenerative disease more broadly. It takes a village to do this work and some funding. So I'd like to acknowledge our partners at UCSF. And would just like to say, please do refer patients to us for treatment. We see people remotely via teleassessment and teletherapy. We provide teletherapy kits to people who don't have computer access. And we're very actively enrolling people with PPA. So please do send folks our way. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
So Dr. Henry, can you tell us a little bit about differences you see in outcomes in populations who speak more than one language?
Sure, that's a great question. So not surprisingly, at least to me and to Dr. Grasso, individuals who are bilingual are very receptive to treatment. Our outcomes are on par for bilingual and multilingual individuals. And importantly, what we see for those who actively speak more than one language is that they can benefit from treatment in more than one language, and we can promote cross-language generalization through certain types of targeted treatment. So we can work on cognates, for example, words that share sound across languages. We see that if we train in one language, we actually get benefit in the other language. And given that speech-language pathologists are working increasingly with bilingual individuals, we of course need to consider how to best tailor interventions to people who speak more than one language. So results so far very encouraging. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, one more question. We have people attending this today from all over the country. Are there ways that families can access treatment in other areas, either treatment or research opportunities through your research?
Sure. Well, first of all, we enroll people all over the country and all over the world. So we are happy to screen and enroll people regardless of where they live. We've been doing teletherapy since before the pandemic, and so we're pretty good at it at this point. So we are happy to see people for intervention at no cost if they're able to enroll in our NIH-funded trial. In terms of other intervention that's available to people in local communities, the major FTD and PPA referral sites have studies underway. So there's a big study underway at Northwestern. Again, we see people through our partner site at UCSF. There are other studies underway also. Only a handful though. But when people don't qualify for a trial, I also suggest that they seek out local speech and language clinicians who are knowledgeable in aphasia and motor speech impairment. Speech language pathologists have all the tools that are needed to provide care to these individuals if they get the referrals. So there's nothing magical about what we are doing, and a knowledgeable clinician really can be helpful across the stages and subtypes of PPA. So part of this is just getting the word out that those referrals need to be made.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Henry. And we'll do our best to get some of the answers to the other questions and can send those out afterwards. We are going to take a short break, and our next presentation will begin at 10:35. Thanks everyone for sticking with us.
Across the country, we walk. For those affected by Alzheimer's disease, carrying flowers that signify why we want to end it. But what if, one day, there was a white flower for Alzheimer's first survivor? What if there were millions of them? Help make that beautiful day happen. Join us for the Alzheimer's Association Walk to End Alzheimer's, the world's largest fundraiser to fight the disease. Register today at alz.org/walk.
I was attracted to Delmed because of its unique vision. They're taking a different approach, looking at how healthcare is delivered, not just the most efficient way, but the way that benefits patients the most.
There's decades of evidence of what actually helps people, but it's been hard to translate that into day-to-day medicine. I came to Dale Medical School to partner with my patients in new and more meaningful ways.
The role of design in health and healthcare is to question some of the fundamental assumptions that have been the foundation of our healthcare system for generations. The circumstances that surround the creation of the medical school and the permission and authority we have to make real change in ways that are very meaningful are what drew me here.
I was attracted to coming to Delmed because I usually approach the jobs that I'm most interested in by thinking about the communities I'm going to work within. And in this case, I was joining two communities. One of those communities is the medical school. The other is Austin. It's not just that I work here, I live here too.
We have a few more minutes before we start our next presentation. If you just want to take a quick break and come back, I will continue playing some more videos for your viewing. Thank you.